Hey everybody, and welcome back to Economics, Chapter 3, the aplia assignment. So here question 1 is about comparative and absolute advantage. Edison and Hillary are farmers. Each one owns a 20-acre plot of land. The table shows the amount of alfalfa and barley each farmer can produce per year on a given acre. They have to decide whether or not to use which acres to use for alfalfa and which acres to use for barley. Who's going to produce which? The first thing we do here is draw the production possibility frontiers for both farmers. So Edison's PPF, his production possibility frontier, is the first line, the blue line. And I got that by saying Edison has 20 acres. He can produce 30 bushels per acre of alfalfa. So 20 times 30 gets us 600 bushels of alfalfa. 10 times 20 gets us 200 bushels of barley. Same thing on Hillary, do the math down here. So 20 acres times 7 bushels per acre gets you 140. And I can't remember what this number is down there, but it's something close to that. Next we have to figure out who has a comparative advantage and who has an absolute advantage. Alright, so Edison has an absolute advantage here in alfalfa. You just read that directly off the table. He can produce 30, that's more than Hillary can produce, which is only 28. Edison also has an absolute advantage in barley. He can produce 10 bushels of barley per acre, whereas Hillary can only produce 7. So Edison has the better land, or is the better farmer. Edison has the absolute advantage in both of those. Then we want to look at who has comparative advantage, though. Who has cost? So if you do the math here, Edison can produce either 30 bushels of alfalfa or 10 bushels of barley. So every time he produces 3 bushels of alfalfa, he gives up 1 bushel of barley. So effectively 1 barley costs 3 bushels of alfalfa, or the flip side of that is 1 alfalfa costs 1/3 bushel of barley. So I got that just by taking the ratio of 30 to 10. That reduces to 3 alfalfa over 1 barley, 3 alfalfa per barley. Hillary, you're looking at 28 to 7, so that's a 4-to-1 ratio. So Hillary spends 4 alfalfas whenever she decides to produce 1 barley, or gives up 4 alfalfa when she decides to produce 1 bushel of barley. So a bushel of barley costs 4 alfalfa, or the upside down of that is that 1 alfalfa costs a quarter of barley. So barley costs Ed 3 alfalfas, costs Hillary 4 alfalfas. That means Ed has a comparative advantage in barley. Alfalfa costs Ed 1/3 of a barley, only costs Hillary a quarter of a barley. So Hillary has a comparative advantage in alfalfa. Second question. So when a country has a comparative advantage in the production of a good, it means it can produce that good at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partner. Then the country will specialize in production of that good and trade it for other goods. So even though one country has the absolute advantage in 2 goods, one of them will have the comparative advantage in 1 good and the other will have the comparative advantage in the other good. So they would trade even if one country has the absolute advantage in both goods. So here's our production possibility curves for our 2 countries, Maldonia and Dazonia. So Maldonia can produce 24 million pounds of tea, 16 grain. Dazonia can produce 12 tea or 24 grain. So in terms of absolute advantage, Maldonia has the absolute advantage here in tea, right? 10 to 12. Opposite in grain. But let's look at comparative advantages. So if we do our ratios again, so Maldonia's ratio is 24 over 16, 24 tea over 16 grain. That's 3 halves, and that reduces further to tell us that 1 million pound of tea costs 2/3 millions of a pound of grain, or 1 grain is going to cost 1.5 T. Dazonia, 12 over 24, that reduces to 1/2. So a tea costs 2 grain, or upside down, a grain costs 1/2 of a tea. So Maldonia gives up 2/3 of a grain whenever they produce tea. Dasonia gives up 2 grains whenever they produce tea. So Maldonia has a comparative advantage in tea. Maldonia grain costs 1.5 tea. Grain over in Dasonia only costs 1/2 a tea. So they have a comparative advantage down here in grain. And the last piece of this question, after specialization, the two countries can produce a total of 24 million pounds of tea. That's because Maldonia is focusing on tea, or they can produce 24 million pounds of grain because Dasonia is producing only grain. So prior to this, they had that much grain because they had 12 plus 12, but they didn't have that much tea. They decided to trade, and your question tells you how much they decided to trade 4 tea for 4 grain. So Maldonia ends up with 4 more teas, less 4 grain. They're at this point over here, which is beyond where they could be before, so they're a little bit happier because they're out beyond their production possibility frontier. Dasonia ends up at this point down here, a little bit outside their production possibility frontier, so they're a little bit happier as well. So they're happier after they engage in trade. So from this point on, I don't put these videos up automatically. I put these videos up only if I get a request. So if you have a question, feel free to give me a request and I'll make a little video and put it up for you. Thanks, everybody.